Think about this for a moment. Right now, in the modern world, you rely on a single sheet of paper to prove that you are even allowed to exist within society. Without your birth certificate, you cannot obtain a passport. You cannot enroll in school. You cannot secure a driver's license, open a bank account, or claim a legal identity. You are, for all practical administrative purposes, a ghost. Most people move through life assuming this document is an ancient, fundamental right, a timeless civic record woven into the very fabric of human civilization since the dawn of organized government. It was not. For the first 124 years of American history, the federal government had absolutely no centralized, uniform system to track who was born, when they were born, or to whom they belonged. From the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776 all the way up to the turn of the 20th century, mandatory state registration of human life simply did not exist. If a child was born in a timber frame farmhouse in Ohio, a tenement building in New York, or a sod cabin on the western frontier, their entrance into the world was registered in a family Bible, scribbled onto a blank page in a local church ledger, or completely forgotten. Over 50% of all home births before 1900 went entirely unrecorded by any government body whatsoever. Millions of citizens lived, worked, married, bought property, and died without ever receiving a single piece of government-issued paper validating their entry into the world. So how did an entire continent-spanning republic survive, grow, and become a global industrial powerhouse for over a century without ever tracking its own populace from birth? The answer is a story of how a massive shift in human control transformed the relationship between the individual and the state. The modern birth certificate was not invented out of public benevolence, nor was it created to celebrate new life or protect child welfare. It was engineered at the turn of the 20th century by an expanding bureaucratic apparatus to satisfy the relentless demands of industrial expansion, workforce management, labor regulation, and military conscription. It was the foundational document upon which the entire modern surveillance architecture was constructed, turning individual human beings into registered state assets. To understand how this radical transformation occurred and how Americans were quietly convinced to trade centuries of unmonitored freedom for a mandatory paper identity, we have to go back to the closing years of the 19th century, when a rapidly transforming nation reached a sudden, chaotic breaking point. To understand how this radical transformation occurred, we have to look at the massive economic quake that shattered 19th century America and brought the old, unrecorded way of life to a sudden, violent end. By the late 1800s, the United States was transforming at a speed unmatched in human history. Millions of immigrants were pouring through coastal ports, cities were expanding into dense industrial mazes, and vast factories were replacing small family farms. But underneath this dizzying economic growth lay a hidden structural flaw that threatened to derail the entire American project. The country was operating a modern industrial superpower using the administrative infrastructure of a medieval village. The financial and social toll of this institutional blindness was catastrophic. In the roaring factories, textile mills, and coal mines of the late 19th century, child labor was rampant, completely unchecked and essentially invisible. Industrialists hired children as young as 6 or 7 years old to work 14-hour shifts around lethal machinery. When reform movements pushed for laws restricting child labor, business owners and desperate parents simply lied. Without a standardized, government-issued birth certificate, a 10-year-old child could be passed off as 14, and a state inspector had absolutely no legal mechanism to prove otherwise. The law was completely powerless against a wall of intentional silence. At the exact same time, public health officials were fighting a losing war against deadly urban epidemics. Cholera, smallpox, tuberculosis, and typhoid fever routinely ripped through impoverished immigrant tenements in Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia, wiping out entire city blocks. Yet local governments were effectively blind. They could not track mortality rates against birth rates because they had no accurate record of how many people were being born in the first place. Disease outbreaks could spread unchecked for weeks before municipal authorities even realized a crisis was unfolding. The situation in the legal and financial sectors was equally chaotic. Life insurance companies, which were rapidly becoming the bedrock of American corporate wealth, were hemorrhaging vast sums of money due to widespread fraudulent claims. People routinely forged church ledgers, fabricated family Bible entries, or simply invented deceased relatives to claim massive payouts. Property disputes dragged on for decades in county courts because heirs could not legally prove their parentage or exact age of legal majority. The public outrage began to boil over in the newspaper headlines of the 1880s and 1890s. Reformers decried the horrific slaughter of children in northern mills and southern mines. Insurance cartels demanded standardizations to protect their soaring capital. Military strategists looked nervously toward Europe, realizing that if a global conflict erupted, the United States Army had no uniform registry to determine who was of military age for conscription. The entire social order was fraying because the state was blind to the very lives that comprised it. The structural flaw was undeniable. An industrial nation could not function without administrative legibility. A decentralized republic built on private family Bibles and local parish registers was inherently incapable of regulating corporate labor, preventing financial fraud, managing public health, or drafting an army. By the turn of the century, the federal government found itself completely powerless to manage the chaotic explosion of its own population. The old ways were dead, burned away in the heat of industrialization, and into that massive administrative vacuum stepped a small, obsessed group of unelected technocrats who saw human beings not as sovereign individuals, but as biological assets waiting to be indexed, catalogued, and managed. Remember the name of one ambitious Census Bureau official in particular, Dr. Cressy Wilbur, because he was about to design the invisible paper cage that would catch every American from the exact moment of their first breath. To execute this vision, the expanding federal bureaucracy required a central strategist, a fanatic for order who could turn human existence into a standardized dataset. Enter Dr. Cressy Wilbur. In the late 1890s, Cressy Wilbur was a physician turned statistical zealot. He did not view the chaos of unrecorded births as a quaint tradition of American liberty. He viewed it as a national emergency, an intolerable defect in the machinery of modern governance. Appointed in 1906 as the chief statistician of the Vital Statistics Division of the United States Census Bureau, Wilbur was not an elected politician, a military general, or a famous statesman. He was an unelected, relentless bureaucrat obsessed with cataloging life. His thesis was simple yet radical. The modern state could not properly manage its resources, its factories, its military, its taxes, or its public health, if it did not own the official record of who existed. The historian Susan J. Pearson, whose groundbreaking work in the Journal of American History meticulously documents this administrative shift, revealed how Wilbur and his small circle of technocrats set out to systematically eliminate the centuries-old reliance on private records. Wilbur realized that as long as the state accepted entries in family Bibles, baptismal certificates, or local parish ledgers as legal proof of identity, the government remained at the mercy of individual citizens. To assert absolute authority over legal age, workforce participation, and citizenship, the state had to seize exclusive control over the act of registration itself. Working from the quiet corridors of the Census Bureau, Dr. Wilbur drafted what was known as the Model State Vital Statistics Law. It was a masterpiece of administrative central planning. The law bypassed the constitutional limits on federal power by creating a standardized draft that individual state legislatures could be coaxed, pressured, or coerced into passing. The mechanism was brilliant and relentless. To force compliance across a fractured continent, Wilbur established the birth registration area in 1915. Under this federal framework, a state would not be officially recognized by the United States government as having a reliable population, and thus lacked full statistical standing, until it could prove that at least 90% of all births within its borders were registered on standardized, government-issued forms. Think about what this meant. For the first time in American history, the federal government defined a human being's legal existence not by their physical presence, but by whether a state official had stamped a piece of paper. Dr. Wilbur was supported from the highest levels of power. President Theodore Roosevelt's administration aggressively pushed for national demographic tracking, recognizing that a global empire required precise metrics on its biological assets. Roosevelt and his progressive allies argued that state registration was essential for human welfare, to enforce new child labor restrictions, guarantee public schooling, and reduce infant mortality. And that was the genius of the pitch. The birth certificate was wrapped in the pristine language of compassion and administrative progressivism. Who could possibly oppose tracking births if it meant rescuing 6-year-old boys from dangerous coal mines or protecting newborns from preventable diseases? But beneath the humanitarian veneer lay a far more pragmatic, calculated utility. The progressive state was not just building a safety net, it was building an inventory system. By standardizing the form across every city and county, Cressy Wilbur removed individual choice from the equation. The state-issued birth certificate recorded the child's name, date of birth, location, parentage, racial classification, and legitimacy. The child was no longer merely a member of a family or a local faith community. From their first breath, they were assigned a legal identity, catalogued in a central state repository, and processed for future obligations to the sovereign authority. By the time Dr. Wilbur published his comprehensive treatise, the Federal Registration Service of the United States, in 1916, the momentum was unstoppable. He had designed a universal tracking mechanism out of thin air, converting a nation of unmonitored individuals into a fully indexed population. They had the master plan. They had the institutional backing of the Census Bureau and the White House. Now, Wilbur and his network of state registrars needed to enforce it on millions of reluctant, independent-minded Americans who saw no reason why the government had any right to meddle in their private family affairs. And they were prepared to use criminal penalties to make sure no one slipped through the net. Sociologists and historians of public policy highlight that the establishment of centralized bureaucratic systems was often birthed out of a desire to manage urban chaos and industrial complexity. As populations expanded, administrative state institutions sought standardized metrics to organize modern society. While these mechanisms inevitably created oppressive tools of social control and inequality, their original architects frequently defended them as essential advancements in administrative efficiency and public order. By the late 1910s, the conceptual framework for national population control had been meticulously mapped out, but turning an abstract model law into absolute physical reality across 48 fiercely independent states required a campaign of quiet, systematic coercion. The federal government could not simply issue an executive decree ordering every family to register their newborn infants. Constitutional limits and a deeply ingrained American tradition of local autonomy made a direct federal mandate politically impossible. So, Dr. Cressy Wilbur and his network of state registrars resorted to stealth, financial pressure, and administrative blackmail to engineer total compliance. The strategy was executed through a brilliant piece of regulatory theater known as the birth registration area. Established by the Census Bureau in 1915, this mechanism created an exclusive club for American states. To be admitted into the registration area, a state had to prove to federal auditors that its vital statistics offices were successfully capturing at least 90% of all live births occurring within its borders. On its face, this seemed like a harmless administrative benchmark, a simple statistical standard for public health tracking. But here is the catch. The federal government began using inclusion in the birth registration area as a prerequisite for federal funds, national statistical recognition, and administrative legitimacy. State governors and health officials who failed to meet the 90% threshold were publicly shamed in Census Bureau reports as backward, incompetent, and negligent toward the welfare of their citizens. The psychological and financial pressure on state legislatures became overwhelming. State after state capitulated, passing mandatory vital statistics legislation that mirrored Wilbur's model law word for word. To enforce these new state laws on the ground, the bureaucracy targeted the primary point of contact during a birth: physicians and midwives. Doctors were transformed into unpaid enforcement agents of the state. Under the new vital statistics statutes passed across the country, a physician or attending midwife who failed to file a standardized birth certificate with the local registrar within 10 days of a delivery was subject to criminal prosecution, heavy fines, and the potential revocation of their medical license. The pressure on parents was equally calculated. State registrars began launching public relations campaigns that quietly redefined unregistered children as non-citizens, legal non-entities who would be barred from the benefits of modern society. Newspaper advertisements, public health pamphlets, and school notices began warning parents that without a state-issued birth certificate, their children would be unable to prove their age, inherit property, claim insurance benefits, or enter public schools. The The state did not need to break down doors to enforce registration. It simply created a world where living without a state-issued identity became functionally impossible. When the United States entered the First World War in April 1917, the stealth implementation accelerated into overdrive. The sudden demand for military conscription under the Selective Service Act transformed the birth certificate from a public health tool into an instrument of military mobilization. For the first time, millions of young men had to prove their exact age to either fulfill their legal obligation to register for the draft or demonstrate that they were too young to be conscripted. The military machine required absolute legibility, and the Census Bureau's growing vital statistics database provided the foundation. In the decades following the war, the bureaucracy tightened its grip. In state after state, local registrars began penalizing parents and doctors for non-compliance. What had begun as a voluntary statistical exercise in a handful of northeastern states rapidly metastasized into an inescapable national mandate. By 1933, every single one of the 48 states had capitulated and joined the national birth registration area. Texas was the final state to fall into line, officially closing the last remaining loophole in the continental United States. Think about the timeline. In 1900, over 50% of all home births in America went completely unrecorded by any government body, and only a tiny fraction of states maintained reliable registration systems. Just 33 years later, in 1933, mandatory state registration was absolute, universal, and legally enforced across the entire nation. The historian Susan J. Pearson, in her exhaustive research on the expansion of American vital statistics, points out the profound irony of this transformation. The birth certificate was marketed to the American public as a shield, a benevolent document designed to protect innocent children from exploitation in factories and guarantee their legal rights. But in practice, it operated as a net. It captured the individual at the exact moment of birth, assigned them an official record, and established a permanent legal relationship with the state before the child could even speak. Consider the sheer scale of the shift. In less than 4 decades, the United States government moved from absolute ignorance of its population's daily births to absolute cataloging. The private family Bible, which had served as the sacred, unassailable record of human life for generations, was rendered legally worthless in the eyes of the law. If a birth was recorded in the family scripture but lacked the official stamp and signature of a county registrar, it was treated as a legal nullity. The state had successfully inserted itself between the parent and the child. It had seized exclusive monopoly over the definition of legal existence. The public never voted on this massive transfer of authority. There was no national referendum, no grand constitutional debate over whether the federal government had the right to catalogue every newborn soul. It was accomplished quietly, incrementally, through administrative rules, model statutes, professional penalties, and bureaucratic persistence. The system was fully in place. The public had accepted it as a natural permanent feature of civil society, completely unaware of its recent artificial origins. And once established, this foundational layer of individual tracking would never be removed. In fact, it was about to become the essential bedrock upon which an even more formidable structure of administrative surveillance would be erected. This investigation connects directly to the broader architecture of control we unravel across secret state files, where isolated historical decisions aggregate into the modern system governing our daily lives. Once the nationwide trap was set and every single state had fallen into line by 1933, the true purpose of mandatory birth registration began to reveal its horrifying scope. What had been introduced to the public as a benevolent measure for public health, child labor regulation, and civic order rapidly metastasized into the foundational bedrock of a total administrative surveillance state. The paper birth certificate was never intended to be an endpoint. It was designed to be the gateway identity document upon which every subsequent mechanism of government tracking would be constructed. Consider the immediate chain reaction. Just 2 years after Texas became the final state to join the national birth registration area, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act of 1935 into law. Suddenly, tens of millions of American workers were required to register for a federal Social Security number to participate in the legal labor market and access retirement benefits. But to receive that 9-digit federal identification number, what was the primary mandatory document every worker had to present? The state-issued birth certificate. The birth certificate had successfully validated the creation of a universal numerical tracking code for every worker in the United States. Without that original piece of paper created under Dr. Cressy Wilbur's standardized system, the entire architecture of federal taxation, labor tracking, and administrative identity would have collapsed before it even started. In the decades that followed, the web tightened with terrifying speed. The simple birth certificate became the mandatory master key required to unlock every tier of economic and social participation. To obtain a driver's license, you needed a birth certificate. To apply for a US passport, you needed a birth certificate. To open a bank account, enroll in a public university, claim state benefits, or enlist in the armed forces, the state-issued birth certificate was demanded as the ultimate proof of legal existence. Think about the profound philosophical shift that occurred here. Let that sink in for a moment. In the 19th century, an American's existence and legal standing were self-evident facts established by their physical presence, their community, and their family records. By the mid-20th century, the individual had been stripped of inherent legal existence. You were required to purchase permission from the state in the form of a certified government document, just to prove to the government that you were actually born. Today, this mandatory administrative market generates millions of dollars annually in statutory fees for state offices of vital statistics across the country. Citizens are forced to pay recurring administrative taxes to state registries merely to secure replacement copies of the document that validates their own biological birth. What began as a statistical exercise by Census Bureau technocrats became a permanent, revenue-generating monopoly over human legal identity. It is worth being precise here about what the official historical record establishes versus what remains a subject of popular debate. It is documented fact that the birth certificate was engineered by federal statisticians and progressive reformers to regulate labor, track demographics, and organize military conscription. It is documented fact that it was used as the mandatory foundation for the Social Security system, state driver's licenses, and federal passport issuance. What remains debated among political historians is whether Dr. Cressy Wilbur and his contemporaries foresaw the ultimate outcome, whether they consciously intended to build a permanent surveillance cage, or whether they were simply reckless progressive technocrats whose obsession with order set off an unstoppable chain reaction of bureaucratic expansion. Regardless of their long-term intent, the structural result is not in dispute. The playbook executed at the turn of the 20th century established the definitive model for modern administrative expansion. Step 1. Identify a genuine societal crisis or inefficiency. Step 2. Introduce an administrative record-keeping system wrapped in the pristine language of public safety, child welfare, or administrative convenience. Step 3. Coerce local authorities and professionals through regulatory mandates and financial leverage. Step 4. Lock the system in place, make it mandatory for basic economic participation, and expand its scope until it becomes an inescapable feature of daily life. The playbook is always the same: crisis, architect, stealth implementation, permanent control. The original paper birth certificate was merely the prototype, the analog blueprint for a much larger and far more comprehensive mechanism of tracking that was quiet, relentless, and waiting just over the horizon. Look at the piece of paper resting in your home filing cabinet or state archive, the standard birth certificate that defines your very legal existence. You take it for granted as a timeless civic right, a fundamental document that humans have possessed since the dawn of organized civilization. But if you pull back the curtain on history, you discover a startling truth. That single piece of paper was not created to protect your rights, to celebrate your birth, or to safeguard your welfare. It was engineered at the dawn of the 20th century as an administrative mechanism to catalogue human beings as registered assets of the state. Today, that paper identity is no longer just a physical document in a county clerk's office. It has mutated into an absolute non-negotiable prerequisite for modern life. Look around at the system you inhabit right now. To participate in society, you are increasingly required to surrender to digital IDs, real ID mandates, central bank digital currencies, and biometric tracking networks. The state no longer merely records your existence. It conditions your ability to buy, sell, travel, and work on your submission to digital verification. And every single one of these modern surveillance mechanisms traces its lineage back to the foundational architecture, established between 1900 and 1933. The birth certificate was the original analog prototype. It established the legal precedent that a human being does not possess an inherent right to participate in society simply by being born. Instead, permission must be granted by the state through an official registration number, a bureaucratic entry, and a stamp of authority. Once that precedent was established, the logical expansion into biometric identity, digital wallets, and centralized tracking became inevitable. Now that you know who built this cage, do you still feel comfortable living inside it? I want to be very precise here because this is exactly the kind of story where speculation tends to calcify into accepted fact. What is documented in the historical record is that statisticians like Dr. Cressy Wilbur and progressive reformers designed standardized birth registration to manage labor, public health, and military conscription. What remains a subject of ongoing debate among political historians is whether these early technocrats fully envisioned the modern surveillance state or whether they were simply reckless empire builders whose obsession with administrative order set off an unstoppable chain reaction. Regardless of their initial intent, the result is not in dispute. The system was built, the net was cast, and the world you live in today is the direct result of that paper transformation. If you want to see past the official story, if you want to understand the hidden architecture of power, money, and control that governs your daily life, subscribe to Secret State Files. Join a community of viewers who refuse to take modern systems at face value. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe mandatory state registration was a necessary trade-off for modern society? Or was it the ultimate surrender of individual sovereignty? And stay tuned for our next investigation, where we uncover the secret meeting that rewrote the rules of global finance behind closed doors.